Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today we are doing our October wrap-up. And this is all of the books that I read in October of 2022. Not as many as you'd think. I love Halloween, but usually there's so many things going on in the month. Especially this month for me, because I had my parents down for one of the weeks, and it just kind of made everything a little bit different as far as what kind of reading I got done. So there was not a lot of books here, but let's kind of go through it. First off, I just want to talk about a short story collection, one of many here. I was reading short story collections out the wazoo the last few months. I don't know why. I just have been consuming them all over the place and loving them. But I finally read Nightmares and Dreamscapes, which is the third Stephen King short story collection. Honestly, not as good as the other two. Well, I say that, but I think Skeleton Crew has a lot of clunkers in them as well. The problem with Nightmares and Dreamscapes is I actually think there's probably about half of this book is pretty great. And I think that this is actually two collections in one, pretty much. I really think you probably should have split this up, release Nightmares, and then release Dreamscapes, where you could because there is a mix of straight up horror in here, and then straight up some of King's more literary fiction work, and even some non-fiction work, stuff that doesn't quite fit in the horror genre. And some of those are quite good, actually. The literary fiction stuff is not great, but just the plain non-fiction story. He has some non-fiction about baseball. I don't care about baseball. I don't like baseball, and I absolutely love this, so yeah, there is good stuff in this collection, but it is way too big and way too long, and there are, like I said, some clunkers in here. Oh my goodness, there's like this terrible story that just goes on for way, way too long about like these people showing up at this old town, this town that's just full of dead rock and rollers, and it's, oh my god, it goes on for too long. But I did like some of the stories in here, and I did appreciate that sometimes they try to go for something a little different. It's very strange because for years I thought that Stephen King was mainly proficient at short stories above all else. And the only short story collection of his that I've read so far that I really loved was Night Shift. Night Shift is one of my favorite short story collections of all time. The other two, not so much. There are higher highs in Skeleton Crew as far as just pieces of Skeleton Crew are amazing writing, like The Jaunt, and of course The Mist that opens that collection up. But I would say Nightmares and Dreamscapes is more consistently fine. So I kind of gave them both the same ranking as a 3 stars. It is really hard to rank some short story collections. Next up, Fright Night Origins, which is a brand new Fright Night book that just came out. This is kind of a mixture of a novelization and setup for future sequels. So if you don't know what Fright Night is, Fright Night came out in the mid-'80s, and it is my favorite vampire film of all time. Well, maybe not of all time. It's definitely of the 80s. It is up in the top echelons there, and there was a original novelization written for Fright Night when it came out, one that was actually very important to the horror genre, which was actually written by John Skipp and Craig Spector, which I believe they actually wrote it before The Light at the End, but The Light at the End came out after. And The Light at the End, if you don't know what that is an 80s vampire film an 80s vampire novel that really kind of kick-started the splatterpunk movement, and that started from the original Fright Night novelization. Now, this version is kind of a novelization, but this is written by Tom Holland, and he's also co-written by A. Jack Ulrich. I don't know the second man's work at all, so I'm not 100% sure on that, but it did feel very much in the vein of Tom Holland. I love Tom Holland as like a creative force. I think he is probably a pretty good writer. Overall, I would say if you love Fright Night, I would pick this up. I think this is really, really fun, and what it adds to the mythos of the franchise, I'm very interested in. I will admit, I think there were a little bit of some editing issues in this. Occasionally maybe characters' motivations didn't really line up chapter to chapter. There were the occasional mix-ups as far as what movies props are supposed to be from. All these like little things that kind of detract from the experience as just an overall book. But I think the good outweighs the bad in terms of that. If you are a fan, and I'm really interested to read the next 2 books, because this is basically half novelization, half setup for a future Fright Night original novels that are coming down the pipeline. I almost wonder if they probably should have just released that new stuff first and then just squeezed in like a chapter explaining what we missed in the first movie, just because for a lot of people this is going to be kind of repetition if you've seen the movie. But overall, I recommend it. I bought it, and I think you should too if you are a fan of the franchise and want to see what else Tom Holland is going to do with it. Next up, another short story collection, of course. I read Autumn Crow finally, and this is Cameron Chaney's book. Halloween, October was the perfect time to read Autumn Crow. So many great short stories here. I really like Cameron Chaney's writing. I really enjoyed the atmosphere presented in these short stories. My only kind of gripe with this, and it's like a minor gripe, I personally never really attached to the idea of nostalgia, and that is kind of embedded in this text. So there is a lot of talk about like, oh, Halloweens will never be as good as they were when you were younger. And to me, I'm like, oh, I disagree with that. I think Halloween's great always. I don't think there is like a limit to when Halloween is great. I also just enjoyed being an adult way more than I enjoyed being a child. So I don't really abide by a lot of the like the nostalgia things that are woven into some of these stories. But that's just like really a minor quibble, because for the most part, I absolutely love this from start to finish. And I will definitely be reading this again, probably a new seasonal read, and I will be very interested in reading Autumn Crow High when it comes out. I believe it's this month or next month, so I'm looking forward to that, and I really did like Autumn Crow quite a bit. Next up, one of my favorite books that I've ever read, full 5 stars. This is Robert R. McCammon's Ushers Passing. I read earlier this year, Stinger by Robert R. McCammon, and I love that book. I thought that book was amazing. And it turns out I am Team McCammon because, yeah, Ushers Passing rocks. I really, really liked Ushers Passing quite a bit. I bought a very nice hardcover of this, and then I was so into this book, and my brain was like trying to defeat me, so I bought the audiobook and listened to the audiobook for the rest of it. So like 100 pages on text, and then the rest was audiobook. I'm kind of glad I did, because the audiobook was absolutely outstanding. I absolutely loved this book from start to finish. It is very much kind of playing around with the fall of the House of Usher and the ideas that Poe introduces in that story, but because the fall of the House of the Usher is literally, the book is supposed to be a closed loop, the short story, because it's supposed to be the very last house. Anyone involved, any ushers in Poe's short stories are dead by the end of that book. So I was like, how are you going to like do like kind of a sequel to this? And it's not really a sequel. This is a book where the ushers are a real family, and Edgar Allan Poe wrote the story, and it was basically implied that he wrote the story about this family. So the book itself has some very, very interesting elements. A lot of it takes place on this plot of land called Usherland. And I really thought Usherland was dumb until I listened to the name, until I listened to the audiobook, and like there's just like these creamy tones of Usherland, and I was like, oh, now I'm in. Overall, great Southern Gothic. The atmosphere in this is outstanding. I loved all the characters. I feel like the characters are very, complex in this. They're not simple characters. I think McCammon really does a great job at expanding characters. There is a lot of history to this. It is very clear, because the bulk of this book is the ushers have earned their fortune from the arms trade. So basically, you are getting parts of the Winchester Mystery House elements put into this as well. So it is kind of a mixture of that very famous kind of ghost story and combining it with some McCammon twists. And yeah, I absolutely love this book. I thought it was outstanding. I will listen again. Might be a seasonal read as well. Most of my Octobers may be the same from here on out because it turns out the October books I read are really, really good. Speaking of October books that are amazing, I read A Night in the Lonesome October, which is done by Robert Zelenzi, and absolutely adored this book. I loved this book. I don't want to get into this book much because I think that this is a book where you don't really understand what the plot is until you finished it. So it is a book where the plot kind of builds day by day and you get more of understanding of what's going on in the plot, why is all this stuff happening, what's the main goal of these characters, how this is all shaping up. And all I want you to know is it is a friendship between a dog and a cat, and it's beautiful. And yeah, I had a little bit of tears. I thought it was beautiful. I love this story so much. I think this writer really understood dogs and really understood cats, and also just kind of really created a very interesting, fascinating world. A lot of very famous horror characters appear in this, and how they play into the final scenario is very interesting. And yeah, I would absolutely recommend A Night in the Lonesome October, but I don't want to tell you too much about it because I think it's one of those books that you get rewarded for going in blind, I would say. Beautiful illustrations here as well. Next up, two books that you've already heard me talk about, Poking Holes and, of course, Lurking in the Dark, the HorrorTube anthology. Already did a review on these. Both of these are great. Absolutely loved them. Had a great time with them. Poking Holes, of course, watch my review because, yeah, that's a very disturbing book. I would recommend being in a good place mentally when you start that book. That's all I'll say. There's a lot going on there. Absolutely loved it. Both of those were great anthologies. Next up, Halloween Slaughter. This is the sequel to Camp Slaughter by Sergio Gomez. I fucking love Sergio Gomez. I love his writing style. I've read his novella, The Visitor. And then, of course, I've read Camp Slaughter and now Halloween Slaughter. Halloween Slaughter, in my opinion, is the first great straight-up slasher book. It is so good. The characters have this richness to them, and I cared about them. I actually didn't want the horror to start because I just really enjoyed all of these characters. Of course, I fell in love with Daphne, the stoner friend who watches horror movies. The dream. She's perfect. I did not want anything bad to happen to her. Of course, it's a slasher book, but I think the horror works better because of how much you like these characters and you don't want things to happen to them. So I was like, oh my god, let's change genres. And it made everything that happened extra horrifying because I cared about all of them. There were no characters in this, even the character who was like supposed to be like the prissy girl and you weren't supposed to like, kind of not supposed to love. I still really liked her and I still really liked her vibe and I didn't want anything bad to happen to her either. So it was really amazing how much I cared about all these characters and how deep I was into this story and how sad it made me at the end. It was really, really good. Sergio Gomez, absolute legend in my books. And yeah, I think this is the first masterpiece slasher book. So I loved this book. Next up, a little thing that I read. This is, so if you don't know, if you're not an RPG player, what RPGs are is role-playing games. Normally, they can be on video games, or what I play a lot are like pen and papers. Think D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. So there is a publisher called Free League Publishing who made an Alien RPG. And of course, we all know I'm absolutely in love with the Alien franchise. And this month, they released a new story expansion pack for the Alien RPG called Alien RPG Heart of Darkness. I flew through this book. I love the story it's presenting. And I am very, 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 very much looking forward to running through some unfortunate victims through the Heart of Darkness. So I absolutely love this and would 100% recommend it. And it also continues. Heart of Darkness is, of course, a reference to the Joseph Conrad story, and Joseph Conrad is very important to the history of Alien in general. A whole bunch of ships are named after that particular author, particularly the Nostromo. There you go. That's a, Conrad book. But yeah, if you're at all into RPGs, 100% recommend this one. Next up, a book that, I had snow come in, and it kind of put me in the mood for a horror book set in the snow. And this one came out in January of this year. I hadn't actually heard of it. I think I looked up best horror novels of the year, and this came up. And this is All the White Spaces by Ali Wilkes. Really, really good book. Really good book. I love Arctic expedition stories, and this is one of them. Essentially, this is all about post World War II. Like a trans man gets on a Arctic trawler and kind of goes out into the unknown, and they stumble upon this old campsite that was used by the Germans, but there's no one there. And it just kind of goes from there. They show up at this abandoned camp. Something weird is going on. We don't entirely know what that is. And yeah, I really, really like this book. I really do enjoy when people do period piece queer stories, because I think in modern parlance, people like to pretend like these people did not exist, right? Like, and it's like, no, queer people have existed all from the dawn of time. There's been gay people, there's been lesbian people, there's been trans people since the dawn of time. Yeah, it's always nice when somebody isn't an idiot and realizes, yeah, that was a thing that's been happening all the time. And I think that All the White Spaces tells that story in a very, very compelling way that I found really worked. And I thought this was a really touching story and was really, really outstanding. Some very, very creepy moments as well. So yeah, if you're a fan of something like The Terror, something in that line, maybe The Thing, that kind of thing, I would recommend All the White Spaces. Very, very good winter set horror from earlier this year. And next up, something that was not so great. This is Ghostland, An American History and Haunted Places by Colin Dickey. Like Colin Dickey, I read Colin Dickey's Cryptid book earlier this year. It wasn't great, and I've owned Ghostland for a while, and I read last year I read the first chapter of this and liked it. This time I picked it up, read the whole thing. I don't think Dickey really understands ghost stories very much. If you're just into history, cool, pick it up. There are some good historical tidbits here. But I think Dickey as a whole is very condescending towards the idea of ghost stories and folklore. He contradicts himself a lot in a lot of his kind of evaluations of these stories. And he's just kind of a dick. It's in the name, Colin Dickey. He's a dick. And it comes through in his writing. He's kind of one of these better than you writers, and it's just I don't like it very much. And I think he jumps to a lot of conclusions with not a lot of evidence in his writing. The same thing happened with his Cryptid book, in which he makes some a pretty, in his mind, definitive statements about indigenous beliefs that are just completely wrong, and it's clear he never talked to an indigenous person for writing it. And I think the same is clear here, where he kind of tells a lot of stories and makes a lot of judgments and doesn't seem to really have talked to the people who he's making these judgments for. That's all I'll say. I just think Colin Dickey is not a very good journalist. That much is for sure. Ending off on a good story. The last book I read, this was a short story collection called Devil's Night by Curtis M. Lawson. Wow, this was good. This is a good-ass book. I really, really enjoyed this. I thought that all of the short stories were really compelling. Some of them were incredibly emotional, and they were accompanied by this gorgeous artwork. I think that this is a book that is set, Devil's Night, if you don't know what that is, in Michigan and Detroit specifically. The 30th of October is called Devil's Night. Sometimes in other places it's called like Mischief Night, and there's all these other names. In Detroit, it's called Devil's Night, and that's for a very specific reason. And this book gets into all the background and folklore of this. This all takes place in the early, like a lot of these stories take place in the early 90s, which is why you will see language here that are like of its era. But I think I think it's written with its heart in the right place. So like it's trying to talk about these, things like racism and all of these injustices that were happening in Detroit at the time, from the language that they would have been using at the time. I think that's important to really capture what it was like in that era. And obviously this is a book that's like dealing with the darkness of that particular night and evening very, very well. And again, accompanied by these beautiful, beautiful pieces of artwork. I would 100% recommend Devil's Night if you're looking forward to that. I hope you guys had a good October, a good month. I would love to hear what you thought of any of these books if you've read them. And also, I would just love to, hear what you guys read. So I hope you guys had a good month. Thank you, and goodbye.